Today I'm talking about perimenopause and menopause and if the process is worse for autistic people and for ADHD-ers. So firstly, what is menopause? Essentially, it's a process that every person who was assigned female at birth will go through, usually in middle age, but it can be younger and it can be older. And it's essentially a time when we have a decrease in hormones, and there's kind of all sorts of fluctuations that go on with hormones along the way, which can cause a whole array of different unpleasant symptoms, really. Not in every person, I should say, but in very many people that go through the process. I think it may be helpful just to talk you through some definitions before I go into the rest of the video, really. And there are essentially 4 different eras of menopause, if you like. And I'll talk about menopause first of all, because I think it's easier to discuss the others around menopause. So menopause is a process that happens usually between the ages of 44 and 55. Although, as I said, it can be any age really. And menopause basically marks the moments that you've been free of periods for 12 months. So it's essentially the 1-year anniversary of having no periods. Perimenopause is the time leading up to menopause. And this is a time when your hormones will be going through various stages of fluctuation, really. So that's your estrogen, your progesterone, and your testosterone. And it's thought that this process lasts between 4 and 8 years as an average. Premenopause is the time before perimenopause, and it's basically the time between puberty and perimenopause. And postmenopause is essentially all the time after your menopause. So symptoms of perimenopause include, I do have my phone here because there's so many of them, changes to your mood, problems with memory, hot flashes, which is a really stereotypical kind of symptom of perimenopause, isn't it? Difficulty sleeping, heart palpitations, headaches or migraines, changed body shape and weight gain for many of us. Skin changes, so your skin can feel more dry, maybe it will feel a bit itchy. Vaginal dryness, pain or itching, UTIs, sensitive teeth is another one. And to be honest, there's all sorts, and I have actually done another video where I go through loads of symptoms of perimenopause, and I talk through my experience of them, and I will link that down below that you can watch afterwards if you like. And for me personally, I started having perimenopausal symptoms at the age of 40 in the form of night sweats, and I never had anything like that happen before, so it was really unusual. And ever since then, I've just had kind of more and more symptoms kind of presenting themselves, really. And I have to say, at the start of perimenopause, I hadn't got a clue what was going on. And I lost my mum at an early age, and I don't have any kind of female family members that I could have turned to about perimenopause. And at that time, I didn't have any kind of strong female friendships, so I felt kind of very alone, and I had to gradually kind of research online what on earth was happening. And through the last 10 years, I've seen so many symptoms kind of wax and wane, which is really common. Very often we won't have all of the symptoms kind of all of the time. They do come and go in terms of their severity, but it can be completely life-altering, and it has been for me. But I noticed that through my research, I was having some kind of symptoms happen that just weren't being kind of documented anywhere, really. And it was in the form of, I had a kind of overwhelming need for routine. I was having some real difficulties with kind of social anxiety. Social anxiety has always been present in my life, but I just felt that it was becoming really overwhelming, and I just did not want to see anybody at all. And of course, these additional challenges that I was having didn't quite match up with perimenopausal symptoms, or certainly any kind of research on perimenopause that I could find. So I was just in a state of a lot of confusion, and it was also quite frightening that I was experiencing something quite different in many ways to many other perimenopausal women. So eventually I ended up going down the autism rabbit hole, and I am so thankful that I did, because it's helped explain just so much for me about my life now as a perimenopausal woman, but also basically everything about my life. And interestingly, my psychiatrist said that I should also think about putting in for an ADHD assessment, because a lot of my traits were kind of matching up with that neurotype as well. So I am now on the waiting list for an ADHD assessment, but it's been completely overwhelming to find out such a massive thing about myself, and I've got so much regret, of course, about not knowing all of this much earlier. But I'm just so thankful to be able to attribute at least some of the things that I've been experiencing to being a neurodivergent person. I do need to say, because it is really important, that although I'm talking about my own experience in this video and experiences of autistic people and ADHD-ers, that I am in no way dismissing the neurotypical experience of perimenopause, because we know that it can be just a hellish time for so many people out there. So it's absolutely not my intention to exclude that demographic. It's just that this video is really about shining a light on the neurodivergent experience. So what about the autistic and ADHD experience of perimenopause and menopause? Well, there is a charity here in the UK called Autistica, and I do mention them quite frequently on my channel because I think they're doing just superb work. And they're a research charity that looks specifically into autism. And in 2018, they decided to look into the autistic experience of perimenopause and menopause as an area of interest, but they were gobsmacked to discover that there was not one paper on this intersection. However, since then, Autistica have done some kind of early studies and early research into the autistic experience of perimenopause and menopause. And what they have found, actually, and this is really interesting, is that the autistic experience is very similar to the ADHD experience. So for the purposes of this video, I'm talking about the autistic experience as well as the ADHD experience. Their early studies suggest that the neurodivergence experience of puberty and pregnancy will basically affect their experience of perimenopause as well, because they're all times of great hormonal change, aren't they? So that in itself can cause very many issues. And interestingly, I don't really remember my own experience of puberty too much, or how difficult it was, because I was going through some really significant grief at that time. So yeah, it's really difficult for me to be able to match up the experiences to see what similarities there may have been. And I've never been pregnant, so I can't give you any kind of anecdotal experience of my own, but I think it's certainly really interesting to kind of compare the two, really, or compare the three with pregnancy as well. And of course, perimenopause and the menopause is just an enormous transition, isn't it? As with puberty and with pregnancy, it can affect us in just so many ways, and that's in addition, actually, to all of the kind of standard, if you like, experiences of perimenopause and all the kind of usual symptoms. We do have kind of additional challenges on top. When we think about sensory issues, for one, from my experience, I've had huge problems with noise sensitivity over recent years. Again, it's something that I've kind of always struggled with, but it's like it's been turned up to 11 over the last decades that I've been in perimenopause, and I am extremely noise sensitive these days. Autistic inertia, again, can be just really overwhelming. And mood changes, when we think about hormones and hormonal changes, I think mood changes are one of the first things that we think of. And of course, in an autistic person's experience of menopause, that can lead to shutdowns, meltdowns, and of course mental health is going to come kind of hand in hand with that for many people. And certainly in my case, I've had huge issues actually with my mental health over the last decades. Well, through my whole life really, but certainly since I've entered perimenopause, it's become, yeah, really quite a significant thing that I've been aware of at times. And it just feels sometimes like my brain isn't functioning at all. For instance, I remember one day, a couple of years ago now, I'm an artist. So there was one day I was packing up 2 orders, and each was an original piece of art, really. So I have to be really careful about who I send it to. So I remember printing off the packing labels and trying to kind of organise both of the orders. And I struggled so much in packing these orders because I couldn't fathom which address label was for which order, which sounds just utterly ridiculous, doesn't it? It's only 2 orders and there's one label to go on each packing box. But I just couldn't trust myself at all. I just could not trust my brain to match up the right label with the right order. And I kept checking it and kept checking it. And I, in the end, didn't trust myself to send off these parcels. I had to wait for Ian to get in the evening to check these parcels for me because I just couldn't compute which label was for which parcel. And honestly, it was just so confusing and I just couldn't believe how stressful it was. I got into such a state about it. So I'm going to move on now to accessing good information. And we know that autistic people may well struggle when it comes to education and accessing information, and that could be for a number of reasons, really. Many autistic people have struggled when it's come to dealing with the health service, for instance. So because of these negative experiences, they're less likely to actually want to talk to their GP or other health provider, and that in itself is really worrying. So they are therefore more inclined to seek information and supports online. And of course, we don't know what quality of information and supports they're getting. So they just don't have access to the same amounts of information, really. And also, they may not have the same kind of support networks as their neurotypical contemporaries may have. So they're less likely to be able to kind of chat to friends or family members. So it can actually be quite a lonely experience. So they're at that point actually really quite vulnerable. And when we consider that menopause is still quite a taboo subject in many ways, and I don't really understand why, because it's such a huge and overwhelming experience for so many people. I don't understand why there's such a great reluctance to want to discuss it, really. And for me personally, I found it really quite awkward to speak to my GP because I just felt like I wasn't saying what she wanted to hear. And I can understand now because I was obviously experiencing a heightened version of my kind of experience of autism in many ways. So it wasn't quite matching up or aligning with what she wanted or expected to hear. So there was almost like a bit of a disconnect going on between the two. So I had to go and see her a few times actually before she'd even kind of discuss menopause or HRT or any other options with me. And that in itself was really quite discouraging in terms of trying to seek appropriate care or supports, really. However, it did eventually lead to me getting on HRT, which I'm so thankful for. And I'll talk about HRT in a little while on this video, but I'll leave it just for now, but I will come back to it. So I found this quote from Autistica really interesting because I think it just says it all, and for me it just really rings true that menopause amplifies neurodivergence and neurodivergence amplifies menopause. And I can't tell you how much I wish I had been able to see that sentence 10 years ago when I started this whole process, because I think it would have explained so much for me, and in all honesty, it would have really saved me from quite a lot of personal pain and confusion. Menopause can bring about co-occurring conditions. So, not long after I first started having symptoms of perimenopause, I then started having some really peculiar symptoms, and I've recently been diagnosed as having MCAS, or mast cell activation syndrome, and I wanted to include a little discussion on this today because perimenopause can be a time in life where other illnesses that we may have will either worsen, or it can also bring about new illnesses. And I suspect I've had some form of MCAS for quite a number of years actually, so well before perimenopause. But perimenopause in itself just really, I don't know, it just seemed to ramp up all of these awful symptoms. And for me, MCAS brings about a lot of chronic nerve pain. The worst is occipital neuralgia, so I'll get nerve pain going right across my scalp and into my eye. I'm also basically allergic to most foods. I'm really reactive to smells and chemicals as well, so I have to be really mindful about my whole environment. Now, MCAS is often a co-occurring condition of autism, so I just wanted to include that in this video because if you are in perimenopause and you're autistic or have ADHD and you're noticing just a wealth of really odd symptoms, it's really worthwhile kind of looking and researching other kind of co-occurring conditions that match up with your symptoms, because not one thing is going to explain all the things, if that makes sense. So for me, perimenopause wasn't explaining everything because I'm autistic, very well could be ADHD as well, and I have MCAS and POTS as well. So I've just had an overwhelming amount of different symptoms really. But we know that the great hormonal changes that we're experiencing in perimenopause can bring about or worsen other conditions. So it's really important to include that in this video. And I have done a separate video on my experience of MCAS, which I'll link below. So if you're having weird symptoms, or if you're becoming kind of really intolerant or even allergic to new things such as foods or environmental triggers, it's well worth your time just going to have a look at that video. So as I say, I'll leave that link below. For many of us, perimenopause can be a time of needing further help and support. And through all of my challenges, I just don't feel like I could function as a person living on their own and you know, trying to deal with all of those responsibilities anymore. I feel like in many ways my partner has taken on a secondary role as being my carer, because honestly I couldn't function in the same way, or I can't function in the same way that I used to be able to. For instance, I find the thought of just going shopping for food just impossible, really. And yeah, just being able to get to various appointments and just dealing with life is almost impossible. And I know I'm fortunate that I have a partner who is willing and capable of doing all these things for me, but my heart just goes out to those that are just in a similar situation, but they're kind of on their own and they're having to deal with all of this on their own, because it's just hugely challenging. So although Autistica has done some great early work in looking at menopause through the paradigm of, being autistic or being ADHD, but there's just so much work that needs to be done. And I really like their framing, actually, of the autistic menopause rather than menopause experienced by an autistic person, because it seems very likely that there are some very unique challenges that autistic and neurodivergent people face in going through perimenopause and menopause. And of course, I do need to say that I'm just one autistic person with lower support needs. But of course, those of us with higher support needs can and will be really affected by menopause and perimenopause, and we need just a whole wealth of research and information so that we can all understand ourselves and each other so much better. And I applaud Autistica for the work that they've already put into the autistic menopause, but of course we just need so much more information, don't we? So I'm going to talk a little bit about HRT now. And basically, as I mentioned earlier, I had a real difficult time in trying to deal with my GP, but she eventually acquiesced and put me on some HRT patches. And I was delighted to be able to kind of at least try HRT, but for me, HRT patches just really didn't work out at all, because they were bringing about just some really horrible kind of side effects, such as vertigo, and they were making my dry eye problem worse, and some other stuff as well. So I just decided to come off HRT, and I just thought, you know what, this isn't for me at all. But again, I was just in a process of having just so many horrible symptoms that I thought I'd give HRT another try. And they put me on some estrogen gel and some oral progesterone. And I have to say, it's been really, really good for me. And it really has helped to kind of even out um, a lot of, a lot of the symptoms that I was experiencing. It's not perfect, but it's certainly made some of my symptoms a lot easier to cope with. And I was having some real issues with insomnia, and it basically cured that overnight for me. So yeah, I was just really grateful to at least have tried HRT. But of course, there's real health disparity out there. It's really difficult for some of us to be able to access HRT. I just wanted to mention it today for those of you that are interested in HRT. It can, for some of us, be really useful, but not for all of us. So it's something to try to talk to your GP or health practitioner about, for sure. I'd really recommend that you do try to do that, even if it means going back to see them a few times. Perhaps you could write a list, actually, of all of your symptoms and how frequent they are, so that you feel a bit more prepared when you go and talk to them, because I know how difficult it is when it comes to talking to your GP. It can be really off-putting. But as we know, HRT isn't right for everybody, and I think Autistica have actually done a little bit of research on this, and it really doesn't work for some autistic people, but it may be worth just exploring that as an option if you are having a dreadful time. And also, I've done a full video on my experience of HRT, which I'll link down below for you to go and watch after this one if it's something that interests you. So going back to the question that I posed in the title of this video, is perimenopause and menopause worse for autistic people and ADHD people? I think it's really difficult to give a definitive yes to this question because there isn't the full and robust research to back that up. But from my understanding, it's a time that can be just profoundly difficult for autistic people because we've got very many additional challenges, and early indications do show that many neurodivergent people, though not all, it has to be said, may very well have a more intense version of perimenopause and menopause, in which some of the ways are mentioned here on the National Autistic Society website, such as increased sensory issues, difficulties with social interactions, and decision making can be really challenging as well. And for me, it really does come back to the Autistica quote here that menopause amplifies neurodivergence and neurodivergence amplifies menopause. So I would love to know if you're an autistic person or a person with ADHD who's currently in perimenopause, and how you're faring up really. Is it just the most dreadful time for you, as it has been for me? Or is it something that you've kind of barely noticed really, because it is important to say that this won't be the experience of every autistic person out there. You might kind of breeze through it, and I absolutely hope that you do. And I'd also be really keen to hear from you if you're postmenopausal and you've been through the whole process, and if you've any words of advice to pass on to those of us in perimenopause, I'd be really keen to hear. And also, I'd be really keen to hear from those of you out there with higher support needs, and how the process is or has been for you too, because it's just so important to hear from a whole variety of different autistic people on their experience of perimenopause and menopause, so that society can be better informed as time goes on. And for those of you that are yet to go through perimenopause, I would love to know if you've got any burning questions about the process or what to expect, because I may well do a kind of second video to this one, or a follow-up video to this one at some point. So yeah, if you've any questions that you'd like to know, by all means leave those down below. But one thing I want to mention before I go is that Autistica UK has done a really brilliant webinar, and I think it was about a year ago actually, on the autistic experience of menopause, or the autistic menopause, and it's just fascinating. It's a couple of hours long, but I would recommend you watch it if you're interested in finding out further information, because I just found it really fascinating. So I'll leave that link below. Also, it would be really helpful if you could share this video with others who may find it useful, because I've noticed whenever I do videos on menopause, they do quite poorly on views. And of course they contain really important information, so it'd be really nice just to be able to get this video out there. And lastly, I should mention that I made this video for two reasons really. One was that I've wanted to make this for a while, but also I had a comment that was really interesting, and although I've reframed the question for this video, I think it really does demonstrate how important your comments are, because they can and do lead to future videos being made. I'm just really hoping that this video makes some kind of sense really, because it's been really difficult to film because of traffic noise and all sorts really. So I'm just hoping it will make some kind of coherent sense by the time that I put it all together really. I guess we'll see. So yeah, I think that's going to be it. So thank you for watching. Give it a like if you got this far, and I'll see you again soon.